5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are live. Coming to you live. It's been live. Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Hey, welcome. As I said, we always appreciate our smart audience. Today, we're going to talk about the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which, borrowing from a Clint Eastwood movie, I would call the bad and the ugly, with maybe a little sprinkling of good. Do you know how many pages this bill is, Sam?
Like 1,000?
Even more. It's like over 1,100 pages.
Nobody reads that, right?
Nobody reads it.
So how do they put it together? They just work in sections and then just kind of Frankenstein it all together or something?
The only ones who really know what's in it are the staff.
Right.
They're the ones who put it together. And, the members, they might look at, specific provisions that they're interested in.
Right.
So if you're from New York, you might look at the state and local tax deduction provision because that affects your constituents. If you're a big-time fiscal hawk, extreme right-winger, you might look at the bottom line in terms of what it's going to do to the deficit.
Do you think anybody in Congress has read it page one to page end?
I never like to say I can prove a negative.
Right.
But it would surprise me.
Right.
If anyone has read it from page one to page end.
I mean, certainly none of the House members or Senate members they don't even have the time to do that, I don't think. I mean, they're already busy enough, right?
Right. And, you ever try to read laws?
Yeah, they're pretty dense.
They're really dense. Well, imagine reading 1,100 dense pages and trying to figure it out. You ever read the IRS code?
Not once in my life.
Yeah, and for good reason.
Right.
It's almost impossible to understand. You have to have a CPA, I think, just to read the code. So you can imagine how dense it is to try to read all of these legalistic changes to the IRS code, much less all the other things embedded in the bill. This is supposed to be, right, a tax and spending bill. But there are all kinds of other things embedded in the bill. But what I really want to talk about is how is this bill going to affect you? What is it going to mean for your well-being as a resident of the United States? Or, we have an international audience that would be interested in this as well. So, as my late great friend Jerry Hebert used to say, one of the crack lawyers for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, another office that has been gutted by Donald Trump, but that's another story. Get it down to where the goats can get it. Right, Sam?
Right. So,
let's just look at the biggest picture.
Okay.
And that is the increase to the deficit, right?
Okay.
Now, why does it matter that you increase the deficit? Who cares?
You tell me.
It matters because it affects the credit rating of the country. The credit rating of the country was just downgraded by Moody's. We are no longer at the highest level, which I think is AAA. We're downgraded to, I think, AA1. That may not mean a lot, but when you downgrade the credit rating, it makes borrowing more expensive. It drives up interest rates, which affects your credit card, right? If you buy a car, if you buy a home, if you buy anything on the installment plan, it directly impacts your pocket. Plus, it affects the markets. If you have your retirement fund in the market, it is going to affect you. And then, heaven forbid, there is the Armageddon scenario in which the United States goes bankrupt or can't raise the debt ceiling and defaults on its obligation and crashes the world financial system. I'm not being Cassandra, a male Cassandra, and predicting the apocalypse.
Who's Cassandra?
She was the seer of bad events, the warning of horrible things to come in Greek mythology. I'm not being that, but that is kind of the ultimate horror. But, short of that, there are all these intermediate effects from raising the deficit.
Like what?
I already went through them.
Oh, right, you did.
Raising interest rates.
Okay.
And what has the Republican Party always prided themselves on? In fact, they've tried to pass a constitutional amendment many times about this.
They've always prided themselves on fiscal conservatism.
Fiscal conservatism, balancing the budget. In fact, when Donald Trump ran in 2016, he said, one of the first things I'm going to do is bring down the deficit, even bring down the debt, and do it big time. Did that happen?
Not that I've seen.
For, several $1 trillion in increased debt for the country. And we're now facing another round of increasing debt and deficit from the party that claims to be for fiscal responsibility and balanced budget. This is not the tax and spend liberals, is it?
Not that. No.
These are the conservative MAGA Republicans. So let's look at the math, Sam.
Okay. Here's
you
the
got
chart.
it up right there on the board.
On the board,
right?
That's a computer monitor.
Oh well, you know me. I'm still in the brick and mortar stage.
You're
of life.
used to chalk,
yes,
and chalkboards, and
actually, I'm used to chisels. And
right,
stone,
right, true.
All right, so we have the cost to the deficit, right?
This is the major parts of.
This
Trump.
is just the big stuff.
This is the major parts of Trump and Republicans' tax and immigration package projected by the increases and decreases to the national debt over 10 years. So red is an increase to the debt, blue is a decrease to the debt.
Right. So the brown, maroon is increases.
Where are you
to
seeing
the debt.
Brown?
I don't know. What color is that?
That's
on top?
red.
Red. It doesn't look real red to me.
That doesn't look red to you?
No, it doesn't. But maybe
right.
I'm getting colorblind.
Everybody put in the chat, red or brown.
So if we add all of that up, right, it comes out to something on the order of 4.5 trillion, not billion, trillion, right?
Right.
But that's somewhat offset, right, by the supposed gains from budget cuts, right. Presuming they'll occur. We're assuming this is going to happen, and it may not, because there are a lot of senators who object to these cuts. But assuming it happens, this nets out, get this, Sam,
okay,
to 2.5 trillion, not billion, 2.5 trillion increase to the national debt over the next 10 years.
So adding $2+ trillion to our debt.
Adding 2.5 trillion,
right.
But it actually adds much more.
Why?
To our debt, because this is just the biggest picture.
Right. You're right.
Remember, it's an 1,100-page bill.
Right.
And there's a bunch of other things that are going to add hundreds of billions of dollars to the debt, likely pushing it well over the 3 trillion mark.
That can't be. Republicans are so good with money. They're so fiscally conservative. They know what they're doing. This has to be a mistake.
I wish it was.
Oh, no.
I wish it was.
Oh, no.
As I said, these are minimal numbers. I've seen even bigger numbers from some sources. So we're already at 2.5 trillion. But what isn't on here is huge increases in defense spending and for the Golden Dome, which is going to be an additional hundreds of billions of the Golden Dome alone, some say, could be as high as $500 billion over 10 years, much less the other increases he's proposing for defense. And then there are increases for his immigration deportation policies, right? All on top of what's going on here. Billions of dollars for his so-called border wall.
That's still a thing?
That, believe it or
What?
not, you know.
I feel like
you remember the movie about Jason? I forget what it was called. Not Halloween, but you know, this slasher
Nightmare
Nightmare
on Elm
No,
Street.
it wasn't even Nightmare on Elm Street. One of our audience will know. Jason was the character, and supposedly he drowns, and all of a sudden he rises up.
That's Nightmare on Elm Street.
No, it's not. It's
What?
not. No, Nightmare on Elm Street was Freddy Krueger. This is Jason. At any rate, this is like Jason rising up out of nowhere to scare the daylights. So we're talking, in my view, well north of $3 trillion, and I think that is likely an underestimate.
Friday the 13th, everybody.
That's it, Friday the 13th. I knew someone in our smart audience would remember it. It's quite old. It's certainly before your time, but it scared the bejesus out of me.
Yeah.
And that's what's going on here. You know, the Jason of the deficit is rising up. But let's parse this further.
Okay.
See what else it means to you. If you want to go to school,
Right.
or if you've gone to school,
Right.
and you have a student loan,
Sure. That seems reasonable.
and most kids have student loans,
Right.
guess what?
What?
They're going to rake you for $300 billion
What?
in additional charges.
What?
$300 billion out of the backs of our students because they're going to make it so much more difficult and so much more expensive to pay off your student loan. You know, that looks like a great thing. Oh, it's a deficit offset. But who is it coming out of? The future of our country.
Right.
Our young people.
They want to talk about spending or saving us from all this waste, right? But then the stuff they're saving us from, they're adding trillions on top of it. So they're not saving us from any waste in the end.
There is no waste identified in that I could see.
But I'm even saying, let's
None of this is waste.
let's say
Yeah.
you think this is waste. You're
Right.
somebody in this country who thinks that all these student loan stuff, all these climate change stuff is a waste. In the end, even though they're cutting all these programs, you're still not saving a dime. In fact, we're losing money still.
We're losing trillions still.
So I'm saying this whole line of reasoning of we're saving the American public from waste is a giant lie just based off of the math, not even the policy, just based off of the math.
Remember the Wizard of Oz, Sam? The man behind the curtain?
Yeah.
That's what's going on here. Don't look behind the curtain because the wizard is bamboozling every single one of you. Exactly so. Even, as you say, assuming this is waste and fraud, none of which is, doesn't matter. They're still slamming us for at least $300 trillion, and I think much more.
And the biggest expense is going to extend Trump's 2017 tax cuts.
Yes, and who mainly benefits from those tax cuts?
Like the top whatever percent.
The top 10, 5, 1, and mostly 1/10 of 1% who save hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. I repeat that, hundreds of thousands of dollars, whereas the bottom 20% save nothing.
Who actually looks at this bill other than lobbyists and corporations and rich people and politicians? Who looks at this and goes, this is great?
Nobody.
Nobody.
They do throw some crumbs in.
All right, they do have an increase in the child tax credit. That is good.
They
right?
increased the child tax credit, which is a good thing. I'm not certain about removing tax on tips because I don't think tips is the problem. The problem is a minimum wage,
Right.
which hasn't been increased in decades and isn't even remotely close to a even poverty level standard of living, even for a single person, much less for family. That's the real issue, which Republicans have blocked and blocked and blocked and blocked. You know, tip taxes is, to use the metaphor, is the tip of the iceberg. It will matter very little, but you should at least, the minimum wage is $7 some odd. You should at least be doubling the minimum wage. That would make a real difference for waiters and busboys, dishwashers, Uber drivers, others who get tips. But so it's a big phony thing, really. So they are throwing in some crumbs, but they are a very small part, as we can see, of the whole package. And, I'm for increasing the standard deduction. That's not a bad thing either. But let's not forget, and we've talked about this before, for less affluent people, are they paying mainly personal income tax?
No.
No. They're paying payroll taxes. They're paying Medicare and Social Security taxes. They pay very little in personal income taxes. They just don't make enough money. And so cutting personal income taxes doesn't help them.
Right.
You'd have to deal with, I'm not saying you should cut payroll taxes, but you'd have to help them in some other way. The biggest way would be to double. And even then, who lives on $15, $16 an hour? And that's double approximately what it is now. So this is all masking the real problem. And of course, as we talked about this before, and we're going to have a whole show on it, what's happening with your money. You don't have to be in the bottom 20. You don't have to even be in the middle 20. If you're in the 99%, if you're not in the 1%, since 1989, $13 trillion. $13 trillion with a T. Many thousands of dollars per household has been taken out of your pocket and put into the pocket of the richest 1% in this country. Now, let's go on. Rescind climate change money. Oh, that's going to save money. But what else is it going to do? It's going to cost way more. That isn't even accounted for in this. What happens when you have hurricanes and floods and tornadoes and fires? Just leaving aside the human toll, quite a number of people died in the Midwest from the recent bad climate.
I mean, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars.
Hundreds of billions of dollars.
Maybe in trillions.
Maybe even in the trillions.
Depending on the...
Yeah. So that isn't real savings, right?
No.
You stop fighting climate change. You exacerbate climate change. You gut FEMA, which is supposed to provide aid. And you are expanding costs by, as you say, at least hundreds of billions and maybe even the trillions. So that isn't even a real saving. It's a phony saving.
Right.
And in fact, the real cost may not be $3 trillion, it may be $4 trillion, when you consider that's not an actual saving at all. Now, cuts to Medicaid.
Which is the biggest cut.
Right.
In terms of dollar amount.
Right. Who gets Medicaid?
You tell me.
The less affluent, people in poverty or near poverty, right? What happens if they lose their Medicaid?
I guess they fall into squalor, I guess.
They can't pay their bills. So either they go without care, or if they're going to get care, where do they go?
To hospitals, I guess?
Yes, to the emergency room. Most expensive, by far, form of care. Plus, if you cut Medicaid, they're not going to get preventive care, right?
Right.
Because they can't afford that. You're not going to get preventive care at the emergency room in suburban hospital, right?
Right.
So you're not getting preventive care. And what does that mean for the people who don't get preventive care?
More people overloading the hospitals.
Exactly. And what's that going to do to costs? Yes. Now, let's look at the other thing. Where is Trump's base? Is it in the big cities?
No.
No. It's out in the rural areas.
Right.
And in fact, these rural areas depend upon revenue for Medicaid because the hospitals are small. They're on tight budgets. I'm just looking at a study here which says hospitals and doctors' office are already suffering with tariff-induced hikes and equipment costs. They will then suffer financially from the withdrawal of Medicaid dollars. Some will be forced to shut down. Hospitals across the country have already started laying off staff because of Medicaid payment delays. So this looks like a cut, but it may not be a cut at all because people are still going to seek medical care. They're going to seek it in the most expensive way. They're not going to get preventive care, which means they're more likely to get sick. They're more likely to get disease, which is going to raise up the costs. Plus, it's going to hurt these people directly and hurt even people who aren't on Medicaid because they're going to go to their hospitals, out in some rural area, and guess what they're going to find?
Closed doors.
Exactly. That hospital ain't there anymore. So you don't have to be on Medicaid to be severely hurt and damaged by such large-scale cuts to Medicaid. And, of course, as we've talked about before, they're targeting the most vulnerable people who have the least resources, the least ability to resist what Trump is doing here.
So not only is this not a beautiful bill, this is a horrific bill.
That's why I said it's either the bad or the ugly.
Right.
With maybe a little bit of good sprinkled in.
Right.
So, so you're hitting the most vulnerable people, but the costs and the damages spread out to everyone.
Right.
When hospitals start to shut down, doctors can't make it because they're not getting their Medicaid assistance.
And as you resend climate change money, air pollution's going to go up, asthma rates are going to go up, lung disease rates are going to go up.
Right, which you didn't even mention. We were just talking about the direct harm, from storms or fires, but the indirect harms from the environment getting worse and worse. So we may be talking about not $4 trillion, but $8 trillion.
What? No, they couldn't possibly do that.
And it's apps because I think all of these savings, certainly the last two, are illusory. I think there's going to be far more costs from rescinding climate change action and cuts to Medicaid than are being offset here.
Well, is our only hope that the Senate won't pass it at this point?
We had talked about this before in an earlier show, Republicans saying, we're not going to pass this. It's got all these problems. And I said, we've heard that whining line before when it came to totally unqualified appointees to critical positions like Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, RFK Jr. as head of HHS. And what happened in the end, Sam?
Whoop, right through.
Right, they all caved, and they all caved in the House.
But this is a little bit different than confirmation hearings, don't you think? Because for the most part, for most of American history, most confirmation hearings are pretty easy. Most people just get through.
Yeah, as I said, they're meaningless because what you say in a hearing amounts to nothing. You can do what you want.
And I get why they cave in that situation because confirmation hearings are BS, right? But this is different. Come on, tell me this is different.
I don't think it's that much different.
No.
I think who is going to be Secretary of Defense in charge of our national security, who's going to be in charge of our health is vitally important. Yes,
sure.
This is obviously much bigger, but those things were very... Plus, they caved in the House. After all that bluster, all that talk, right?
Right, true.
They caved in the House. And so you want to count on Republicans in the Senate to fix this?
No,
I got a big bridge in my hometown of Brooklyn to sell you.
Oh, God.
But that isn't all.
What? There's more?
This isn't just a tax and spending bill.
Oh, no.
There are all kinds of other things thrown in. Defunding Planned Parenthood. Supposedly Trump said, I'm not anti-choice. I believe in abortion. Well, he said that just for the campaign. So now they're shutting down Planned Parenthood, which does far more than just offer abortion services. It offers all kinds of vital health services to women who can't get it anywhere else. So guess what's going to happen if you shut down Planned Parenthood?
What?
Women are going to get sick.
Right.
Women are going to get sick, and, while you're also slashing medical care in the country, not to mention all the ways in which RFK Jr. has slashed medical research, medical information, access to vaccines. Pile that on in terms of threats to American health, which are going to exacerbate costs. And I think I mentioned this before, but it's worth mentioning again, what some Democrats have called the assassin's provision.
What? Oh, the stealth gun thing.
Yeah, the silencer. Let's not tax as we already have the silencers. Let's make it easier for criminals to buy silencers.
Right. We talked about that.
Yeah. It's not for gun collecting. It's not for hunting. It's not for self-defense. Then there is the attack on our universities. We've talked about this a lot.
Is this related to the bill or unrelated?
It's in the bill.
Oh, it's in the bill.
All these unrelated things are in the bill. A huge tax on university endowments for universities that have a certain ratio of endowments to the student body, but you can't count international students, so it shrinks the bottom number and raises the top number. Absolutely gratuitous. It's just part of Trump's attack on higher education for no reason other than they won't conform to his own distorted, politically driven view of our history and current reality. We've talked about that at length before. It's all laid out in the 1776 report that Trump issued at the end of his previous administration. You can read it for yourself or check out our previous archival presentations. Boy, in 11 pages, I can go on, but I think we've hit the highlights. And there are a couple of other things that I would like to talk about.
Right.
Who is Trump having dinner with tonight?
Oh, right. The Trump coin.
The Trump coin. And what backs up the Trump coin? Why would anyone spend millions of dollars on Trump coin?
To cozy up to Trump.
To buy influence with Trump, because the coin itself is worth what, Sam?
Nothing.
Zero. Absolutely nothing.
It's worth as much money as people put behind it.
Right. To get influence with the president. And he is now meeting with the... Oh, there's one more thing I want to talk about that isn't on here. I forgot.
About the bill?
About the bill. I've got to get to it.
Get to it. Go ahead.
You know what SNAP is?
Yes.
That's the food stamp program.
Right.
That also less affluent Americans rely upon. And there are also provisions in the bill that are going to make cuts to SNAP, that are going to make it more difficult for people to buy groceries and for all of us drive up prices. I should not forget food stamps. But back to the meme coin. So there's absolutely no reason to buy the meme coin except to buy influence. And that's exactly what's happening. His big meme coin buyers have unique, privileged access to the president. And do we know who they are, Sam?
No, because the blockchain is anonymous.
Right. So they could be the cartel leaders, right? They could be oligarchs.
They're definitely oligarchs.
Yes, for sure. Foreign spies, people facing criminal charges in this country, right? We have no idea who they are. Now, I've ceased being amazed what this Karen Levitt has to say. But she says, oh, no, they're not really buying influence with the president because he's doing this in his personal capacity, not in his official role as president, and he's not doing it in the White House.
But he's currently president.
Of course, he's still the president.
Right.
Doesn't matter where you have access to him, whether it's Mar-a-Lago or the Oval Office, it makes no difference.
If you have access to him in a 7-Eleven bathroom, you still got access to the president.
Still got access to him. That's the most absurd argument, among a plethora of absurd arguments.
I heard her also say that, that there's this new MAGA, I guess it's not new, it's been around for a while, but they're using it especially with this Qatari plane and Trump meme coin thing. They keep saying, Trump's made this great financial sacrifice to this country. He left this luxurious, lavish life for an act of service. He doesn't take any money for his salary. Since he's become president, that his net worth has more than doubled.
I have heard that he's made billions.
Yes.
Not to mention all the deals that his sons have negotiated. Do you think someone like Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump if their father was not president, if he was just, say, a host on The Apprentice, do you think the Saudis and the other rich Arab leaders would give them the time of day?
No.
Not a chance. So that doesn't even count the multi-billion-dollar deals or the $2 billion that the Saudis gave to an investment fund run by guess who? His son-in-law, Jared Kushner.
Jared Kushner.
You know, again, it is so contrary. You know, the gaslighting is astonishing.
Crazy. Yeah, it really is crazy.
So,
coin.
It is in fact illegal to bribe a federal official.
Sure, I'm glad that's illegal.
Yeah, and that's what else is going on here if not bribing Trump to get access? Here's the law. Federal bribery laws under 18 U.S.C. Section 201 prohibit corruptly giving, offering, or even promising anything of value to a federal public official to influence their official acts. You can't even promise anything,
right?
Much less give anything to influence their official acts, which is exactly what you're doing when you have privileged access to the president.
So you're not saying this is a gray area. You're saying this is a black and white bribe.
A black and white bribe. And it has to be done knowingly, but you think these people don't know that they're giving millions of dollars for access to the president?
Of course they know that.
Of course they know. It's exactly why they are doing it. It's a serious offense that includes imprisonment, fines, and guess what?
What?
Disqualification from holding federal office.
Okay, so here we go. Trump is out. We did it, folks. Trump is out.
If you were Attorney General, maybe he would be, but who's Attorney General?
Pam Bondi.
And what are the chances she's going to indict Donald Trump for bribery?
So the only person on earth who can actually hold Trump accountable for this is Pam Bondi. That's it? Nobody else?
No.
Oh, the Congress.
Sam, there is an impeachment clause in the Constitution, right?
Right.
And you can be impeached and removed for high crimes and misdemeanors, which is vague. But there are two very specific things in the Constitution for which you can be removed. You know what they are?
Bribery.
Bribery and treason. Bribery is right there in the Constitution. It's not a matter of interpretation like high crimes and misdemeanors,
right.
which, you know, they argue about every time there's an impeachment
so
inquiry.
Congress is going to save us. It's black and white bribery. You can't do bribery. You're saying this is a black and white bribe. Congress will save us, right?
And who's in charge of the U.S. House? Mike Johnson. And what are the chances that Mike Johnson will launch?
How could this be possible? How could a president start a cryptocurrency, host an event with all his biggest bidders? It's a bribe. And we're just sitting here, everybody twiddling their thumbs, and we can't do nothing about it. Nothing. That can't be possible.
Well, this can't be as serious as what the Republicans were blasting Obama for, right? Wearing a brown suit, which didn't make him look presidential. I mean, that's way more serious than taking hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes. This should be an open and shut criminal case. Now, we know that he's got all this immunity, right?
Right.
But Karen Levitt gave it away.
Caroline.
She said, whatever her first name is. I know I got a last name right. Levitt.
Yeah.
She said he's not doing this in his official capacity, right?
Okay.
He's doing this in his personal capacity. So he should not be protected. Even though obviously
you're saying under the immunity decision by the Supreme
Court, it has to be
Court.
official acts.
Oh.
Even though he's still the president and it's still bribery, it's not part of an official act. So he should be subject to prosecution.
What would that prosecution be? Bribery?
Bribery.
But if it's
very serious crime.
But if it's not in his official act as president, then technically it's not a bribe.
It is a bribe because he's still president, but he's not acting in his official capacity.
Right.
So he's still being influenced, but he is not acting under some constitutional authority.
You know, I'm often one to say that Trump's never going to be held accountable. I shoo off all these court cases. None of this is going to. This is the thing that should bring it. This is This is the most clear bribe, maybe other than the Qatari plane. But these two things are the clearest bribes I've ever seen in my life. And somehow nothing's happening. Even I'm like, come on. Something should be happening here.
They're the clearest bribes in the history of the country, not just what you've seen in your brief lifetime.
Right.
And the framers were very, very concerned about a chief executive. With all the power they put in the chief executive. And there was a big debate in the Constitutional Convention about whether the president should have all these powers. So they were very, very concerned, most of all, about a president being corrupted. That's why bribery stands equally with treason. Think about that in the Constitution. That's why there's an emoluments clause saying you can't take anything of value from a foreign entity. They were fantastically concerned about these matters.
So we have all these protections, and yet we're not protected.
That's correct. And that's the tragedy.
That's the tragedy
that we've come to under Donald Trump. The Constitution, the law, American tradition, out the window. And Trump's not going to stop. Look, how many times in his whole life, he's 78, I think, has he ever been held accountable for anything?
Never. And he's not going to be held accountable for this either.
No, he's not. Now, I suppose there's a remote chance that the Democrats will take over the Congress in 2026 and impeach him. But they've impeached him twice before.
Didn't do much good.
Didn't do any good because he'll never get convicted in the Senate.
Is this back to this whole virtuous persons quote that you've used before?
I've used this so many times, and I'll, say it again. James Madison was the framer of the Constitution, the primary framer, the primary theoretician behind the idea of balance of power, checks and balances. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's very close, you can design a system however you want to prevent corruption and tyranny. But in the end, any system is dependent on the virtue of the people and their leaders.
Now, let me ask you a question. Why wouldn't, to avoid all this bribery stuff but still get all his money, why wouldn't Trump just open the coin, let all these rich people pour all their money in, and then just not meet with them? It seems like the whole meeting is what turns it into a bribe, right? It's like, I give money to this meme coin, and I automatically get a meeting with the president?
2 points. One, he doesn't care, right? Because he knows he won't be held accountable. So he loves to shove things in our face.
True.
Let these liberals whine and complain and, to no end.
Yeah.
2, he wants the adulation. That's what he lives for. Have these people come to Mar-a-Lago, kiss his ring, tell him how great he is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what he lives for.
It's not at Mar-a-Lago. It's in Virginia. He couldn't make it down to Florida.
All right, whatever it is, it's not, he's not Lyndon Johnson who lives for the details of legislation,
Right, good point.
He lives for adulation.
That is true.
All right. There are many more things. I just want to mention one more thing, a very positive thing.
Okay.
We've talked about this a lot, the courts as guardrails. A huge decision just came out today from a Republican-appointed judge which said, you've got to rehire the people you fired in the Department of Education because you cannot, in effect, repeal and destroy a congressionally established department by hollowing it out by firing the employees. That would be, in effect, overturning the will of Congress, which a president does not have the authority to do. Republican-appointed judge.
Okay, some good news.
Yeah, there is some good news. So let's get to questions from our brilliant audience.
Okay, some housekeeping before we get to that.
Absolutely.
If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you know when we post and when we're live. I see that a large percentage of you that are subscribed don't have the notification bell on. I see that. You can't hide from me. Donations and members get priority in questions. You can follow us on our socials below. Let's see. There are 1,400 people watching, only 500 likes. Let's get those likes up. All right.
Let's also, you talked about memberships.
Yeah, I just said that 2 seconds ago.
I'm never mind. Okay. Sometimes things pass me by because I'm thinking about something else.
Right.
There's a lot in my head.
This is from Philip H., our good friend.
One of our good friends, yes.
This bill also neuters some of Congress's ability to regulate spending and gives that power to the executive. Any clue where the full bill can be read?
You can read it online. Just Google it, and Philip H., if you read the full bill, we'll bring you on.
Yeah, true, actually.
And you can talk about it, because I am not as busy as I am, and I'm now working on, my 15th book.
Wow.
15th. Then, by the way, there's the 14th, available for pre-order, Conservative at the Core. The #1 book published by Notre Dame University Press this year, according to their foundation that supports them. It's available for pre-order. It'll be out September 1. That's 14. I have a contract for 15.
What?
Yes.
I don't have any contracts.
Well, how many books have you written? Never mind. Don't answer that. So I'm working on my 15th. But Philip H., if you have the fortitude and the ability to plow through that, we'll bring you on, and you can talk about some of the nuances that we've obviously missed, because we clearly haven't come close, in a half an hour, 40 minutes stating everything.
Professor, there is reportedly a provision buried in this big blasphemous bill. That's a good name.
That is a good name.
That will eliminate the judiciary's capacity to hold officials in contempt of court. This impacts Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case, but has much wider implications, effectively eliminating any restraint on Trump. Have you seen this provision, and is there any hope anywhere in our future? That's a hard
If this
question.
provision stayed in there and was adopted, it would eviscerate the separation of powers, the balance, checks and balances. Of course, it would destroy the ability of the courts, whose role is to hold the president accountable. I haven't seen it in the current version. I know it was in an earlier version, and I think I might have even mentioned it on a previous show. I haven't plowed through the entire bill. I've hit some of the highlights, and I haven't seen it in the current version. But Philip H., if you're going to read the bill, you could let us know. But as far as I could see in a cursory examination, it wasn't in there anymore. They also removed another totally dangerous provision, which would allow Trump to remove the tax exemption from any organization that he deemed supportive of terrorism. And, he could deem any organization supportive of terrorism. That does not seem to be in the current version either. But I'm not positive about this court thing, but I didn't see it.
When Dems take control in 2026, is there anything that can be done to amend this bill?
Be very difficult, because it would have to get through the Senate. And Democrats could take over the Senate, but it would be a real long shot. They would have to net 4 seats. And that seems very unlikely, but get to work on it.
2-part question, totally unrelated. 1A, it's a travesty that the blame for yesterday's shooting outside of the Jewish History Museum is being placed on college students protesting genocide and not on those charged. What are your thoughts?
That's just outrageous. As a Jewish person who's lost family in the Holocaust, I can't tell you how outraged I am. And whether you're Jewish or not, you should be outraged. How Trump is exploiting anti-Semitism, which he couldn't care less about. Remember, he said there are fine people among those shouting, the Jews will not replace us. They blame George Soros, for the Holocaust Jewish survivor, for every ill in America. Couldn't care less. And this is absolute shameless political exploitation. It couldn't be worse.
Yeah, I saw Pam Bondi speaking about the shooting, and I don't know, she was just so aggressive, about talking about anti-Semitism. And when I watched her and saw her speak, it felt like an act, and just felt kind of sickening that
truly sickening.
The right wing in America are using anti-Semitism to pass their own fascist agenda.
And the right wing has been guilty of anti-Semitism right from the Ku Klux Klan through Marjorie Taylor Greene, who claimed, there were Jewish space lasers raining down on the United States. Can you imagine that? And she's still, one of the most prominent Republicans in the U.S. House. They haven't condemned her. They haven't expelled her. They haven't removed her committee assignments. When it's a Republican grossly spouting anti-Semitism, that doesn't seem to matter. It only matters when they can use it politically.
Yeah, and our hearts go out to the couple that was killed.
Of course, that's just horrible.
Tragic situation, but it's not college students protesting's fault that this
nothing to do with it exactly.
Unrelated question about sports. Do you think the Knicks have a shot after last night?
Oh my God, did that break my heart?
If you don't follow sports, the Knicks had the biggest collapse in sports history.
Playoff history, anyway.
At least basketball playoff history.
Basketball playoff history. Up 14 points with 2 minutes and 52 seconds, and they lose the game. Do I think they have a chance? Yes. I didn't. My immediate reaction was, I'm finished. I'll never win. But remember, they got blown away by the Celtics in, I think it was game 5 to make it 3-2. And then they blew out the Celtics by 38 points in the next game. So they do have some resilience. But that was, for a Knicks fan who, I don't think the Knicks have won anything for 50 years in terms of a finals championship. So, for those of us who've been on the drought for that long, that was pretty deflating.
Yeah. And going back to the college student protest for a second, I'm not saying that every protester on every college campus was, there were some protesters who were probably advocating violence.
Of course, there always are.
Right. And but you can't, we have to have some nuance in these discussions. We can't just say it's all the protest's fault or it's not the protest's fault at all. It's like the vast majority of these protesters are college students. They're peaceful.
Right.
They're not advocating violence.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe some
people infiltrate them. That always happens.
But yeah,
look, there have been studies on this, and I think I've mentioned this some time ago, Sam. What group in America is most responsible for terrorist murders since 9/11?
The far right.
The far right, and it's not close. It's certainly not left-wingers.
Our next question is from member Brady. They say, it seriously seems like the FAA is not doing a good job keeping people safe in the sky. With multiple crashes and more near misses, should the Republicans just privatize it, since that has been done successfully in many other countries, such as Canada?
Sam, you're much more expert on this. I'll shoot this one to you.
I can't comment on this.
All right, I can't comment on this either. I am not an expert in air traffic safety, and I don't want to get into this because this is something that does involve life and death, and unless you're a real expert, you shouldn't be pontificating about it. But I have to say, I find it strange that there has been such an escalation of aviation disasters since the advent of the Trump administration and its war on federal workers. I'm not claiming it's related. I don't know, but it is striking.
Donald Trump is still promoting the idea that there is a white genocide happening in South Africa. Sorry, I laugh because it's just so ridiculous, but anyways. He even showed a YouTube conspiracy video to the president of South Africa. This is something I've noticed from CON, capital C-O-N, conservatives for a long time. They really like to play up this idea that white Christians are the most persecuted group on earth, when in fact they're the most privileged. Do you think they express these beliefs as a justification for attacks on secularism and other religions? What do you think is the impetus for this?
You couldn't be more correct. Even before Trump singled out white Afrikaners as uniquely endangered, never mind other countries are ridden with, violence and civil strife and displacement. Long before that, in his campaign speeches, going all the way back to 2016, Trump proclaimed, that America's a war against Christians, and Christians are continually being persecuted. How many non-Christian presidents have there been, Sam?
Zero.
Every single president has been a Christian. How many non-Christian vice presidents?
Zero.
Yeah. I mean, come on. And if you look at CEOs of major corporations, look at the House, the Senate, state legislatures, Christians, particularly white ones, are overwhelmingly overrepresented. As the questioner correctly indicates, they are the most privileged. That's why Trump, consistent with his MO, has to fabricate something. Right. That video was totally fabricated. He claimed it was all of these graves, right, of these white Afrikaners who'd been murdered. It was nothing of the kind. They were memorial markers put up. They did not actually mark real graves. It could not have been more false and more misleading. And far from being persecuted. From what I've read, the Afrikaners are about 7% of the population in South Africa. And you know what percentage of the land they hold, Sam?
Like 80 or something?
70%. Yeah, this is the persecuted group. By the way, if genocide was really being committed, and there are like 2 to 3 million of these white South Africans, how many do you think would want to flee the country and come to the United States if they were being mass murdered?
All of them?
All of them. If the Jews in Germany were allowed to come to the United States during the Hitler years, how many would have come here?
All of them.
All of them. But out of the millions of Afrikaners, how many came here?
Like 49 or something?
Like 49.
Something like that.
You know, if you don't want to believe anything else, that certainly gives the ultimate lie to this phony idea that genocide is being committed against white South Africans. What is true in South Africa, something to do with genocide or targeting white people, there is a severe crime problem which cuts across racial lines.
I have a theory. I'm not even a theory. I think I know why they do this, why they promote all these sort of attacks on whites, attacks on white Christians, because it's become a winning issue. Because if you look at how white men vote, white women vote, they're mostly voting for Trump these days, majority. And they've conjured up this narrative, like Cosmo Trilby pointed out, that somehow white people are under attack. And they're using that because it's working for them.
It absolutely
it's not
is
really
working
it's
for them.
It's horrific, but it's not rocket science.
And it protects the privileges.
Right.
That's the other part of it. You know, just like, oh, Trump's losing all this money, you know, from being president. It's the same kind of thing, you know. By spewing out these lies and fabrications, you're protecting the privilege.
And it's funny because you can follow these white attack narratives all the way from like these fringe right-wing media straight to Trump. I heard a report that basically followed this story from fringe right-wing media outlets to bigger right-wing media outlets like Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, and then straight to the president.
And you could follow it from the Ku Klux Klan, which was the right-wing manifestation of grassroots extremism back in the 1920s, when they were formed to defend, in this case Protestant, but white Protestant Americans against the threats from Jews and blacks and foreigners. Goes back 100 years, and even before that, even into the 19th century, when there were all kinds of attacks on, for example, massacres of black communities, massacres of Asian communities. You know, I've said this many times. There has always been this polarity in America. It's not new. You know, we were one of the last countries to get rid of slavery. One of the last, not a leader, as the 1776 report lies about. Took a civil war. Horrible bloody war to end slavery. So there's always been this polarity between this very racist, very repressive, very violent society and a more inclusive, multicultural, tolerant society. You know, don't deceive yourselves into thinking, you know, America has always been this wonderful, benevolent place.
There's one reason and one reason alone why Trump allowed these refugees in and not other refugees. Because if he was to let refugees in from other African nations, guess what color they would be?
Yes, exactly. We all know what color they would be.
That's the only reason. Because he needs to keep this this white fright narrative alive.
That's what he said much earlier about immigration. All these horrible countries, Asia, Africa, South are sending us their people. Why can't we have nice people like from Norway?
Yeah, it's pretty sickening.
It's right out front. But he's not going to stop because it's worked.
Yeah,
for him.
That's what I said. It's a winning strategy.
It works.
It's working. He's scared white people in America to vote for him.
He's been elected president twice. Yeah. Any other politician, can you imagine any other politician with 34 felony convictions, with a civil finding of sexual abuse, with a civil finding of massive financial fraud? Would any other politician in the history of the country survive for a moment?
I guess not.
No, but he's gotten away with it, so he will not stop. I warn you. He has no shame. He's gotten away with it for over 50 years, ever since he slid out of a finding by the Justice Department that he was violating the Fair Housing Act by discriminating against minorities in his real estate company. Ever since he slid out of that in the early 1970s, he's gotten away with everything.
And he likes to push, and this was something that Tucker Carlson explicitly pushed, is this white replacement theory. If he allows brown and black refugees to come into the country, he's, in his own theory and the right's own theory, he is perpetuating this whole white replacement.
Yes, and
agenda.
That also goes back 100 years.
Right.
If you go back to the 1920s and look at what right-wingers were saying, they didn't call it white replacement, they called it race suicide. That, good white Christian people weren't reproducing enough, and, these inferior people, in those days, it wasn't just blacks and browns, it was also Jewish people from Russia and Lithuania were reproducing too much.
Thank you, Philip H., for donating some memberships, 5 memberships.
Oh, we like that. Thanks.
All right, we've talked about this a bunch.
How much time do we have?
4 minutes.
All right.
How many more questions do you want?
4 more.
With Congress neutered, if SCOTUS rules that nationwide injunctions aren't allowed anymore, neutering the judiciary, is democracy officially dead?
Well, I'm not going to be, the coroner of democracy and pronounce it dead because, we've been very resilient throughout our history. But it would certainly be very seriously wounded, no doubt. Because the courts at this point are really the only check that we have, aside from the people. We always have the check to the people, and I've stressed many times on this show of the kinds of things you can do as a resident of the United States or even a resident abroad to fight back.
We just got more. Kathy Nelson with 5 gifted subs. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
Are you following the Karen Reed trial? Do you think she's guilty or innocent?
I have not. Maybe you have, Sam. I've got so much to do between prepping for this show and writing my 15th book. And I've got a big case in Texas that I'm going down to El Paso next week to testify. So I haven't followed it.
I don't even know who that is.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, 2 more.
Okay. This is a long one.
Can you pare it down?
It's hard.
All right.
I haven't read these ahead of time.
I know, it's hard.
Live. It's hard to live summarize. For much of American history, tariffs were primary sources of federal revenue. 1860 back to 1790, U.S. government relied heavily on tariffs to fund its budget. During this period, tariffs accounted for 90% of federal government revenue. This reliance continued into the late 19th century, but after 1913, the introduction of federal income tax significantly reduced the government's dependence on tariffs. Professor Lichtman, in your opinion, will this administration eliminate the federal income tax, and will abolition of federal income tax encourage investments in innovation in the United States?
Got to realize, back in the 19th century, federal spending was a fraction of 1%
right.
of what it is today. There is no way that tariff revenue can come even close to replacing the federal income tax. It's an absolute pipe dream. Plus, it doesn't even take into account the additional costs of tariffs to the economy, which is going to reduce revenue. I know Trump would love to get rid of the federal income tax, which would help his rich friends even more than this bad and ugly tax bill. But there is no way tariffs can remotely come close, even leaving aside all the deleterious effects on the economy and other revenues that the government takes in.
All right. Is this our final question?
Final question.
Okay. It's from Carol. Carol says, now that Trump has upended the executive branch and altered the world stage, what can be reversed with a Democratic president and Congress? Most of the executive orders issued by Trump have been denounced by the courts, but our American culture is still damaged. What changes can be reversed, and what will be here to stay? I see no positive outcome to all of this.
I can give you a little bit of hope, Carol. The bad news about executive orders is that Trump can just issue them on his own without having to go through Congress, and can issue them very quickly. As we've seen, he set a record in, whatever it is, 115 days or so in the number of executive orders that he's issued. The bad news, so that's the bad news. The good news is they can all be rescinded by the next president if the president is a Democrat. That's what Joe Biden did when he first came into office, rescinded a lot of the executive orders of Donald Trump. And conversely, that's what Trump did when he came into office in his second term, reversing a lot of the executive orders of Biden. So there is good news that those executive orders, regardless of what the courts do, can still be reversed if there is a Democratic president elected in 2028. The problem is that's a long time away, and a lot of damage can be done, in those 3+ years, even assuming we get a Democratic president.
Yeah, I still have hope that I definitely think Trump is and will do a lot of damage, but I do think we will get through it, and I hope that in the years to come, a lot of his reversible damage will be reversed.
From your lips to God's ears, Sam, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay. With that, we will wrap up Lichtman Live for the evening. The good news is the Lichtman Live post show comes up right after this.
Wow, that's really good news.
I know I've seen some people donate just for fun. So far, Mills, Brady Engen, Be Like Water. Thank you guys for your donation. Ollie and Wendy also became members today. And thank you again, Philip H. and Kathy Nelson, for donating some memberships. All right, Dad, what are your final words to the people?
I don't expect you to read 1,100 pages, but as we've explained, this directly affects you, no matter what your income or wealth level is, whether or not you're a student borrower or on Medicaid. This bill reverberates across America.
All right. Thank you, sir. Say goodnight to the people. I will see you in the post show.
Very good. And I'll see you next Tuesday.